The Boy from Yesterday. Before we get into Chapter 17 today, I just would like to remind everyone to please play this in the order of the show, starting with the preface episode and then moving on to Chapter 1 so that you hear the story in sequence. Sometimes it's hard for podcasts to play in sequence because it wants to play the most recent episode first, but if you're new to the show and new to the story, you don't want to spoil it. You want to start from the beginning and go from there so that you enjoy the full story. Also, I'd like to encourage everyone to please rate and give a review of the show and spread the word so that we can help as many people as possible across the world to enjoy the story. And now, Chapter 17, In My Own Little Corner. The day after Chesterfield Day was very different from Laurel's just a few blocks away at Emily Lemmon's house upstairs in her room. For unlike Laurel, for Emily, there were no close encounters with the supernatural that shook her concept of reality in the form of a handsome young farm boy from another century. In fact, there was no one except Emily, as there often was not, for this was Emily's lot as the only child of somewhat reclusive and conservative parents who didn't socialize much and seemed to be from an era more like the 1950s than anything else. Her Chesterfield Day costume set aside on the bed, Emily sat at the desk in her room, piled high with books from school and some others she had read for fun. For although Emily did not have Laurel's good looks or the ability to turn heads, she did have a couple of academic awards that were stuck on the shelf and largely ignored, except when her mother occasionally dusted them, not quite understanding what Emily had won them for. Emily knew. There was one from 3rd grade, when she won the spelling bee for spelling parallel, which she didn't consider was all that difficult even at the time. There was the one from 8th grade, when she won a science contest. They had had a ceremony in the school cafeteria towards the end of the school year, and she came up on a little stage to accept the little cheap gold plastic trophy from the head of the science department, Miss Otten, whom the kids called Miss Rotten, the rotund, masculine-looking teacher with a permanent scowl on her face, but who smiled at Emily, perhaps in solidarity as a fellow nerd, as she handed Emily her award. As she left the stage, feeling how light the cheap plastic felt in her hand, she caught the eye of Neil Newport, her 8th grade crush at the time, who was one of the sexiest boys in school because even in the 8th grade he could already grow a decent mustache to exactly match his wavy platinum blonde hair. She had wanted so badly for Neil to say, "Congratulations!" but his attention deficit disorder just allowed him to glance at her, glance back at the stage at the next kid getting an award, and then tap his buddy on the shoulder to ask, "How long does this go on till?" Emily continued walking up the aisle to her seat, looking down at the ground, trying to hide her disappointment at Neil not noticing her, when she heard somebody nearby, but unseen, quip, "Brainiac," as she passed. That's how she came to ignore the awards on the shelf, just there for decoration, just like the little Madame Alexander dolls from around the world she had collected too, at every birthday, every Christmas, all just decoration and gathering dust, except when her mother cleaned, which she insisted on doing, which Emily felt was just one more way her mother used to get into her room, always suspecting Emily of doing something like international espionage or some such nonsense her mother read about in some conservative magazine. If Emily had her way, she would have a few less perfect report cards or cheap plastic academic trophies, and a few more of the attributes she saw in the magazines she liked to read in her free time. She didn't just read the magazines, it was more that she experienced them. In the pages of Vogue or Cosmopolitan, even People, she didn't read some of the articles and see the glamour photos, she transported herself to them. It wasn't the models who were wearing the fabulous clothes, Emily was. In her room, alone, with the door closed, at her desk and under the desk lamp that shone down on the slick, shiny paper of the magazines, away from the pastoral world of Chesterfield, and upstairs from her father reading his umpteenth newspaper, and her mother knitting yet another garment that Emily wouldn't be caught dead in, Emily escaped into a world she feared she would never know, but yearned for. Walking a red carpet, posing in the wind of an exotic desert, sipping champagne on the balcony of a high-rise penthouse with a beautiful view of the sparkling nighttime skyline. At her desk, Emily did all of these, and her mind wandered as she flipped through the pages almost absent-mindedly, one after the other. As she pictured herself in the dramatic designer clothes, she simultaneously had images in her mind of her life in Chesterfield. The Swedish-looking blonde guy who smiled at her in the lecture hall last week as she sat at the end of a row of seats, only to get her attention so that he could pass her and sit down next to a beautiful, exotic-looking Indian girl down the row and watch as they began to chat, possibly as a couple, or possibly having never met before, but in either case Emily knew the Indian girl could be talking to the Swedish boy, but not her. She thought about how yesterday, on Chesterfield Day, she had seen Christian bring Laurel a glass of the punch, heavily spiked as it was, and saw how Laurel smiled and kissed Christian lightly on the nose as a thank you for the glass, and how Christian smiled back, locking eyes with her, and realizing how Emily had never really locked eyes with anyone the way they just had. Emily got her own punch, spilling a little bit as she did so, making little red dots on the front of her period dress, and then talking with TJ and Peter and wondering how they got stains out of hoop skirts in the old days. She thought about talking with Laurel at the Rocket Diner numerous times, having conversations about boys, school, anything else, but seeing how Laurel's face changed when she got a text from Christian, part blush, part excitement, part concern, maybe even part guilt that usually meant begging off from Emily and rushing to meet Christian wherever he was. Laurel was the kind of girl who got texts from her boyfriend fairly frequently, but not her. She thought about what it would be like to wear the beautiful Vera Wang wedding dress she saw toward the front of her new issue of Vogue and the model's upswept hair. Emily looked up from the magazine into the reflection of herself in the mirror above her desk. She looked down at her own hair, long and wavy but a little messy, and her thick-brimmed black glasses and pale complexion. For a moment she swept her hair up with both hands, trying to replicate the hair that she saw in the model, but then realizing as she looked in the mirror that even though she could try to copy the upswept hairstyle, that's where any similarity to a Vogue bride model ended. The model could be glamorous in the Vera Wang gown, but not her. Emily let her hair fall back down and pushed her bangs out of her eyes and looked around her at her desk of the piles of books and realized she should be studying them. There was always studying to do if you wanted to make the kind of grades Emily was used to. She wondered if other girls in town were studying in their rooms like she was. Maybe they were. And maybe they were out with their boyfriends, going on drives, playing games, strolling a park. Maybe they were making love. Maybe they were holding hands. But not her. She took heart that she was going to meet TJ in a little while to get a book at Main Street Books for a class the campus bookstore didn't have. That helped. Emily's friends, though few, were the world to her, and helped to take her mind off the daily frustrations and disappointments that always seemed to be there.